All right, so we're going to talk about the so-called short-run shutdown point. Basically, what we're going to do is answer the question, when should a competitive firm stop producing given that its profit is negative, right? This isn't a question we have to ask if profit is positive, right? You'll always just produce. So if profit is positive, meaning total revenue is greater than total cost, we're always going to be making the decision to set our quantity, our output positive, right? We're going to be operating. But it turns out there are going to be certain circumstances when the answer isn't so obvious when profit is negative. And we're focusing here on the short run because it also turns out in the long run, this will be kind of an obvious choice. So first off, remember the definition of short run versus long run in our model, right? In the short run, by definition, we have certain costs that are fixed, right? And we said we're imagining, right, that we sign a lease to a factory, so we have to pay the rent every month, regardless of whether we produce or not. In the long run, that's the end of that contract, and if we shut down, all of our costs will go to zero. So let's kind of first think about what the negative profit implications are in the long run. So in LR, in the long run, if our profits are negative, we have the option, right? We can keep producing or we can shut down, right? So given that our profit is negative, we have the option of setting output equal to zero, which will push total revenue to zero, total cost will be zero, and therefore profit will be zero. Right? So we've already answered the question. In the long run, you're always better off shutting down than operating when profit is negative, because you can improve your situation by bringing your profit up to zero. In the short run, again, it's not going to be so clear. Right? So the big difference here is in the short run, the decision of when to shut down and when to keep operating will actually depend on the different types of costs, the variable cost versus the fixed costs. Right? So the key idea here is, in the short run, as we've seen, if we shut down, if we set quantity equal to zero, the good news is our variable cost will go to zero. We send all of our workers home. We don't have to pay them anymore. Our fixed costs, though, are stuck with us. They're going to be positive, right? You still have to pay that contractually obligated rent on your capital. But of course, if we're not producing anything, we're not selling anything, and we're not earning any revenue. Okay? So what is going to happen here is the firm's going to make the decision that if I can earn enough money by producing in the short run to at least pay my labor, right? If I can pay off my workers and then pay a little bit of that rent, right, which you're going to be stuck with, I'll be better off operating. Okay? So let's kind of think about that. So in the short run, if our total revenue is at least as great as our total variable cost, or in our more kind of familiar terms, if the revenue per unit, the price, is at least as great as the labor cost per unit, then you want to keep producing, right? Keep that level of output QI greater than zero, even if profit is negative. And again, the story here is that we have enough revenue coming in to pay your labor, pay those wage bills, which is, of course, our total variable cost. And we can pay some of our capital, some of that rent, our total fixed cost. Whereas if we shut down, all of that rent comes out of our pocket because our revenue would be zero. If that flips around, if our revenue is so low that we're not only losing money, but we're unable to cover our labor costs. So if total revenue drops below total variable cost, or that revenue per unit price drops below our labor cost per unit, our AVC, then you don't wait around for your contract to come up, right? You're going to want to shut down immediately. You set quantity equal to zero, and that way your losses are restricted, right, to just paying that capital cost, right? So losses, your negative profit, equal your fixed cost. You don't have to pay those wages out of your pocket as well. So let's look at an example here. And let's just set some numbers up here. So imagine we have a firm that has total costs of 1,000, which is made up of our variable cost, we'll say is 600, and our capital cost, our fixed cost, are 400. And let's see how that firm would react in different circumstances. So kind of option A, if the total revenue is equal to 700. Again, we immediately recognize, of course, that we're losing money. If we're producing, total revenue minus total cost will be negative 300. So now the question is, we know we're going to shut down in the long run, but while we have that contract, what is going to be the best option here? So the firm can opt to stay in business, right? And if they do that, like we said, our profit here is going to be our revenue minus cost, 700 minus 1,000, or negative 300. But think about that in terms of the variable and the fixed costs, right? Our total revenue is greater than our total variable cost. So we've got that 700 coming in. Total revenue of 700. That can be used to pay off all of our variable costs. And we've got 100 left over. Right? We can pay 100 of our fixed cost. We still have the 300 of those fixed costs. Got to pay a total of 400. We can pay 100 of it with our revenue. The 300 that comes out of our pocket is, of course, our losses. Okay. So not great, but that's kind of option one. Option two, with these same numbers, would be, well, let's just pack it up. Let's shut down, right? And again, what that means is we stop producing, quantity goes to zero, and therefore revenue goes to zero. And again, we fire all of our workers, and our variable cost goes to zero. So what we're left with is paying the entirety of our fixed costs out of pocket. So our profit level is going to be equal to that negative total fixed cost, or negative 400. So since revenue is greater than variable cost, just like we said, we're better off staying in business. We lose 300 per period rather than 400. So we're above that so-called shutdown point. Now what we'll see is if we start from the same information, now this is kind of even worse scenario, option B, what if this firm's revenue drops to 500, but all of the costs stay the same? Well, the same option is in front of us. We can stay in business and we'll have our total revenue minus total cost, so our profit level, 500 coming in, we had 1,000 coming out, so we'll be losing 500. But just as was the case before, because it's independent of your revenue, if they shut down, we'll have that profit of negative 400. We just have to pay our fixed costs out of pocket. So now this seems like the best way to go. So if the firm shuts down, our profit will be, again, negative total fixed cost, or negative 400, which is the better option, the better of two bad options. Okay? So in making this decision, all you need to be able to compare is revenue versus variable cost. When revenue is above variable cost, you're better off staying. When revenue is below variable costs, you're better off shutting down in the short run. Again, in the long run, in either case, we're going to shut down. Okay, so what this gives us is a definition, essentially, of where the firm is going to operate. And let's look at this on the graph, our familiar kind of profit maximizing graph. For the individual firm. So we've got our little qi indicating that this is a single firm. And we've got our marginal cost curve, something like that. And let's draw that U-shaped average variable cost. Okay. So what we've defined here is all of the combinations of price and quantity where the firm will actually be producing. It's going to be whenever price is above average variable cost. Right? So right at that point, below that point, we're going to shut down. Above that point, so all of this area on the marginal cost curve, that effectively is going to be the firm's supply. How much you're going to produce at given price levels. Below that point, down here, is going to be no production. Right? The firm is going to be shut down if the price drops below that level. So our supply curve for the individual firm will be the marginal cost, which is kind of how we've always thought about it. But now we can be more specific. It's the marginal cost above that shutdown point, that average variable cost. So right at that intersection there, where marginal cost hits the average variable cost, that is going to be the shutdown point. And this kind of answers a question that may have been bothering you, right? That we've defined this marginal cost curve that has that little check shape, right? That has that little downward slope to it because of increasing returns. Well, we never see a little tail on a supply curve, and that's why firms are never going to produce down at that end, because it's going to be below the shutdown point. That's when the price is so low that you're not going to wait around and produce. Okay. So let's add one more thing here that's going to be very important and will take us to the next topic, that now that we've defined the individual firm supply curve as their marginal cost, go back to the very beginning and think about how we define a market supply curve. Remember, it's the summation of all the individual supply curves. And we just want to bring that kind of back into play here. So when we talk about the market supply, let's call that S sub M, it's going to be the summation of the marginal cost curves, summation of marginal cost of all firms in the industry. So we can shorthand that. S sub M, market supply, is going to be representing the summation of the marginal costs of all the firms in the industry. And this will be important in the next segment, where that term N, the number of terms we're summing across, is the number of firms. And remember, in a competitive market, N is going to be some large number. There's a lot of firms producing the same product. Okay? So based on this, what you should be able to do is identify the short-run shutdown point on a diagram as that intersection with average variable cost, explain why it represents that point at which firms will stop producing in the short run, and if given in a numerical example like we saw, be able to pinpoint why, right? Why does it make sense for a firm to produce in this situation and not produce in another situation? So be able to compare profit levels under the two options, producing or not producing, and you will be in good shape. So we've set everything up very nicely to look at the long-run evolution of a market in this type of situation. When profit is positive or negative, firms are coming and going. When is it going to stop? How is that going to settle down? So we'll take a look at that next.